Hello everybody, welcome to JTV. So one of the things that I think is a question that's arisen so much throughout the last few years and decades is the question of how is it that anti-Semitism has managed to survive in this supposedly anti-racist age that we live in, this post-Holocaust world where racism is the greatest crime of all. To me, the way that I've always made sense of it is the fact that there is this growing view in the Western world that can only sort of see virtue among victims. The more you are a victim, or perceived victim, in whichever way it may be, economically, geopolitically, whatever it is, you have virtue. And it doesn't look at virtue in terms of who's done right, who's done wrong, all that kind of stuff. It only looks at it through the prism of victimhood. And for some reason or another, there's this growing viewpoint within some political ideologies that Jewish people cannot be seen as victims. And therefore, they're just blind to any prejudice towards Jewish people. And I recently came across an article which articulated, perhaps far better than I have tried to over the last few years, the article is called The Dangerous Logic of Anti-Racism, written by Tom Owolade, who I am thrilled is joining us here today on JTV. He is a writer and a critic based in London. Tom, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote an article on a website called Unheard, which I think is, by the way, a brilliant name for a news website and commentary website, because it's sort of like a play on words. It's saying unheard as in these views haven't been heard before, and also unheard, we're not following the herd. I really like the name of that. And you basically argued, I just want to read out the start of your article. And you said, basically, that today, racism is no longer just about prejudice towards a particular person based on their race. It's about power. It's about systems. And you said, by this logic, if that's what racism has come to mean today, about is your group sort of systemically oppressed, then evidence of prejudice is insufficient qualification for racism. The group you are prejudiced against also needs to be structurally oppressed. And that explains why white people can't be victims of racism, because they are not systemically disadvantaged in schools, employment, and the criminal justice system based on their race. And then you asked, if I scroll a little bit further down, what does this mean for ethnic minorities who are not disadvantaged in contemporary Britain along those lines? And basically, you then went on to talk about anti-Semitism and said that Jewish people, who by some measures are performing disproportionately better, as some other minorities are doing, some parts of the anti-racism camp cannot see Jewish people as victims of oppression or racism in any sense, and therefore turn a blind eye to it. And that's how you explain, what happened with the whole Corbyn phenomenon. My first question I want to ask you is, how did you get into this whole sort of world and topic in the first place, and what's your background, and did you always sort of see it this way?
Not necessarily. When I was a teenager, I subscribed to the structural definition of racism, the definition of racism that says that you can only be a victim of racism if you are disadvantaged along structural lines, so along education, employment, and in the criminal justice system.
Is there a name for that worldview? Does that have a name?
I think I would just define it as the structural definition of racism. So some people call it critical race theory. I think both of those would sufficiently describe the sort of thing I'm talking about. And I think I sort of espouse that view sort of superficially. I didn't really subscribe to it in a critical or in an intellectually developed sense. I just subscribed to it because it was essentially a fashionable ideological view to espouse. But then I began to think more critically about it, and I started to identify the logical fallacies within it. And I think the most significant fallacy with that argument is something called the disparity fallacy. So the disparity fallacy is the fallacy that says disparities are necessarily a consequence of discrimination. So for instance, if you have certain ethnic groups which are doing disproportionately badly in terms of criminal justice system, employment, and education, then the disparity fallacy would imply that those groups are doing badly because of racism, because of their race. So, for instance, certain Black Caribbean groups do badly when it comes to employment and education. And the disparity fallacy says that that's because of their race. However, certain Black African groups do extremely well in terms of education and employment. But if you say that the reason why Black Caribbean groups do badly is because of their race, then necessarily you have to say that Black African groups do well because of their race. And therefore, those Black African groups, by that very logic, can't be victim of racism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's that I thought about this, and then I sort of linked this to anti-Semitism, because if you look at the way in which anti-Semitism is, it's a very particular form of racism. Um, Different types of racism say that certain groups are they demonize certain groups on the basis of them being sort of inferior. But if you look at many manifestations of anti-Semitism throughout time, it's essentially a conspiracy theory. It's about this powerful elite who are secretly controlling the world. So it views Jews as essentially superior. So there's that sort of consonance between that disparity fallacy and the way in which anti-Semitism often manifests itself.
And by the way, it's interesting that actually this conspiracy theory of Jewish, domination and power and control actually even existed at times when Jewish people were disproportionately disadvantaged economically. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, written at a time when the Jewish people were, dirt poor in Russia in the Pale of Settlement. So it is interesting that even when, to me, and this perhaps is my next question. Do you think that this is just a facade to justify prejudice, a deeper prejudice towards Jewish people that we see existing? Often it tends to be on the far left. Or do you think this is just, the fact that they're blind to Jewish, racism is just an unfortunate consequence, as they are towards perhaps other ethnic minorities that are performing well? Is it just an unfortunate consequence of their worldview that they're blind to the oppression of well-performing minorities, or is there something more sinister going on?
I think the answer is twofold. So to some people, I think it's just a case of blindness and a case of insensitivity, a case of indifference to racism against Jewish people. But in other instances, I think it's more sinister than that. So I used the example of the Black British rapper Wiley, and I'm not sure if you saw his Twitter rant.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You can inform our viewers, for those who don't know. I mean, we have a lot of American viewers, and so you can explain what happened. He's a British rapper called Wiley, and he had some anti-Semitic outbursts a few months ago.
Yes, a couple of months ago. Over, I think it was a Saturday, but I might be wrong. But on one particular day, you went on essentially an extremely vitriolic and hate-fueled Twitter rant, and it went on for like 24 hours. And Twitter eventually suspended his account. And in those tweets in particular, one of the striking things was that he essentially recycled an old anti-Semitic trope that was previously propagated by the Nation of Islam, which states that Jews were disproportionately behind the transatlantic slave trade. So Jews played a disproportionate role in the enslavement of African slaves. And I think in that instance, it's that structural definition of racism is more sinister than just the sort of indifference that characterized the other people who espoused this viewpoint. In the instance of Wiley, it's viewing Jews as essentially sort of like parasites, sort of like parasitic capitalists. There's a phrase, the socialism of the fools. that's usually attributed to the German Social Democrat August Bebel. They view Jews as this capitalist forces, capitalist and racist as well. So it's that twin combination, and therefore to be an anti-racist, to be opposed to systematic oppression, you have to be opposed to Jews in some form.
Isn't the great irony of all this that this new way of seeing racism, that this what you're saying is in and of itself racist, because they're categorizing Jews as this sort of homogenous, all-powerful body that all are the same and they are equally oppressive. That is in and of itself racism, is it not?
Yeah, of course, yeah, it is. But I think when
Are they blind to that?
yeah, they can't. But I don't think that racists have a very good sense of irony. I think that's part of the reason why they are racist.
That goes back to our earlier question: is this just is this sinister, or is this just an unfortunate consequence of their worldview? And so which one is it? You're saying basically for some it's one, for some it's the other.
Yeah. I think it depends on the person, but what I would say is that one of them leads to the other.
Yeah.
So one of them is a necessary consequence of the other. So like the Wiley view is just the sort of more Ash Sarker view taken to its logical conclusion. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about Ash Sarker, and who is a Corbyn, big Jeremy Corbyn fan and advocate. But before we talk about what she said, you said in your article that Jeremy Corbyn he just doesn't see Jewish people as in any way oppressed today, and therefore cannot in any way sensitize himself to any prejudice towards Jewish people. So do you think in the case of Corbyn, there's nothing sinister going on with him, or there is?
Oh, I think there are many things sinister going with, because I think it's even if it's not on the same level as Wiley, for instance, even that sort of indifference or that lack of empathy to Jewish people, I think explains the reasons why he has endorsed organizations like Hamas or Hezbollah or several anti-Semitic figures. I think that thin air for anti-Semitic prejudice explains to a great extent why he has endorsed such hate figures.
Yeah, and you highlighted this very revealing line that sort of far left Corbyn supporter Ash Sarker said, where she said, quote, "Racism against Jewish people does not result in the harsher prison sentences, wage gaps, stop and search, or unequal healthcare outcomes that we see with other groups." So basically, Jews, by this logic, as you wrote, do not qualify under the definition of racism. So does this mean basically, in the eyes of the far left today, it is literally impossible to be racist towards Jewish people?
Yes, by that definition, what I think they would say is that, because when you actually pinpoint that, saying that by your definition of racism, Jews wouldn't count, they would say, oh well, that's not my definition, and then they try to change what the definition is. So it's something known as, have you heard of a phrase called Mott's and Bailey?
No.
Mott's and Bailey switch is when you try to pin down an argument, and the person making the argument switches definitions around.
Right.
So it's basically switching the goalposts.
Yeah.
So I don't.
Yeah, I
think
try that sometimes with my mum.
Yeah, I don't think they would openly admit that's what they're saying. But if you actually look at the arguments, that's the implication of the arguments. It's saying that Jews don't count, essentially.
Right. So if someone is literally, if I've got Jeremy Corbyn on one side and Ash Sarker on the other side, and we watch, someone spit at a Jewish person on the road, and I'll say that Jew just experienced racism, did they not? They would probably, surely they would say, yeah, they did.
Yeah. They would say yes, they did. It's just that when
it's not a big concern
because they would say yes, they did, because it's that's sort of an extreme and immediate example, but it's the
It's not systemic in their
yeah,
view.
yeah, it's not systemic in their view.
Right, right. So the next thing that I want to ask is, before we sort of go on to the big issues with their worldview, this worldview of systemic racism, that our focus on when it comes to racial issues is about which groups are just underprivileged economically, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to wage gaps, all these kind of prison sentences, all those kind of things. Doesn't that kind of don't they have a point though? Isn't there some value and virtue in looking at being focused on systemic disparities? I know one of the points you made is that sometimes even when there are disparities, that doesn't necessarily mean because of prejudice, which makes obvious sense to me. Obviously, you're going to have disparities in any meritocratic or free market system, but is there not some value in looking at disparities through the prism of race?
Yeah, there is some value because obviously there was a time when and there is obviously many countries around the world where this still exists, where disparities are a consequence of structural racist oppression. Um, and I think that's one of the reasons why um, I can see exactly where they're coming from, and I think it's a very easy fallacy to fall into, because it has been true throughout history and in many places that disadvantages in terms of education and employment, and also suffering under the duress of the criminal justice system, is a direct consequence of institutional racism. Of course, that's true. Um, but the problem is that that sort of viewpoint um, flattens out the complex experiences of different ethnic minority groups. And I think that that definition of racism is provincial to those particular experiences. I think my piece essentially argues for a more nuanced and a more complex understanding of racism, um, because the other definition isn't simply doesn't simply lead to anti-Semitism or lead to indifference towards racism against Jews, but it's also at a very basic level an unsophisticated understanding of how racism manifests itself, and how racial groups as well are not the same. Um, I think that's one of the fundamental points that I'd like to emphasize, is that different ethnic and different racial groups are not the same, and ironically, assuming that they are the same is itself a form of racism, I would say.
And what's your view of the term white privilege? Do you think it's a legitimate observation today in the Western world, in the UK and the USA? Or do you think it's also, as you just sort of said before, it's unsophisticated, it ignores other forms of privilege, growing up with two parents, different, did you come from middle class, lower class background? And also ignores the fact that there are some ethnic minorities that you mentioned in your article that outperform white people, like, Indian, Chinese, perhaps Jewish.
Mm. Yeah, but I don't like the term white privilege, because, as I was saying, it links back to what I was saying about the disparity fallacy, and also because I think it doesn't really reflect the sort of progress that other ethnic minority people have been making. It doesn't accurately reflect the fact that many the group that's struggling the most in education is white working class boys, um, or that certain ethnic groups do extremely poorly, like um, Irish travelers, for instance, will do the worst in terms of will do the worst in terms of educational outcomes. So I don't like the term, because if you take the term to its logical conclusion, if you say the reason why there is white privilege is because white people don't suffer in terms of education, employment, and the criminal justice system, then necessarily that implies that there is something known as Indian privilege or Chinese privilege, because those things also apply to Indians and Chinese people, and perhaps Jewish privilege as well. And if you think about the term Jewish privilege, that raises certain alarm bells, obviously, because that links to anti-Semitic tropes.
Yeah, absolutely. But what do you say also to the argument that there's also, intergenerational trauma experienced by certain races, by certain groups, and that therefore, even if some groups may do better than others today, and there might not be, you talk about the disparity fallacy, there may not be the same level of disparity that there was in the past. We have to compensate. We have to, pay reparations or in whatever capacity for the racism of the past. And I wonder how that would play in terms of anti-Semitism, because it's been one of the world's greatest and most intense forms of hatred. What do you say to that worldview?
I would say you have to be more specific by what you mean, because I think one of the problems with this entire debate and discourse is the lack of specificity, the lack of focus and detail. Like, which particular groups are you talking about? Like, if you say, oh, black people, but which black people? Do you mean black people who are descended from slaves? Or do you mean black people whose parents are upper middle class Nigerians? Do you mean black people or Somali refugees? Or do you mean black people whose parents come from Trinidad? There's a lack of specificity, a lack of focus when it comes to identifying what people actually mean. And I think that's what I would say in response to your question about reparations. What specifically are you referring to?
Well, indeed, and I think that's an important question that needs to be looked at in more detail. And of course, and who does? There's a question also of who should it apply to in terms of reparation. All these kind of questions, I think they're essential. The last thing I'd like to talk about is, even under this sort of worldview of, we only look or care for racism when we believe it's systemic.
Mm.
Is it really fair to say, with an objective viewpoint, that Jewish people don't face any systemic oppression or racism today? Ironically, as we said earlier, I think one of the ways they face oppression today is by this very worldview. But when I look at Israel, for example, so post 1967, where Israel suddenly shocked the world and was able to defend itself against all the surrounding Arab armies that wanted to annihilate it, since that point, Israel has been seen by many, and a growing amount of people, that Israel is now the dominant force, even the oppressor in the Middle East, or at least the big power, and certainly not the underdog. And my question is, is that really fair? Is that a fair way to look at Israel, especially when you think about the history of the Jewish people up until now and the purpose for creating Israel? Yeah. When you also look at the fact that whether or not it won the war, the fact is it's still surrounded by a lot of hostile people and hostile nations. And so also, when I look at the double standards applied to Israel when it comes to questions of engagement in warfare and other such things, particularly at, let's say, the United Nations. I mean, I remember when Israel engaged in a defensive war in Gaza in 2014, I felt nervous wearing one of these things. When I was walking around London, and there was a massive spike in anti-Semitism. So, because you had it. Sorry.
And in France as well.
Exactly, in France as well, and throughout Europe. So, is it even fair to say that Jewish people and the Jewish nation are not facing a systemic kind of oppression today? Is this worldview that we're seeing even objective in analysing the state of the Jewish people today?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because there's a sort of double bind, isn't there? So that there's this sort of implication that Jews are only good as long as they're essentially passive victims, but if they try to defend themselves, then they become the oppressors. And I think what you said about um, how the worldview itself, um, ironically, is a form of racism. I think that's really pertinent here, because um, essentially Jews are stuck in this double bind, and they can't really escape from it. And I think racism as well. When we think of racism, I think um, being trapped in how people perceive you. I think that's one of the psychological aspects of racism, because racism isn't simply something that happens materially, but it's also psychological. Is that you are basically paralyzed, whatever you do, and it applies to other forms of racism as well, but definitely to anti-Semitism as well.
Absolutely. Um, and the last question I really want to ask you is there any way out of this? Can we move away from defining racism purely along systemic lines because it has so many unfortunate consequences, as you highlighted in your article? Is there any way, do you feel hopeful that we can move out of this very narrow definition of what constitutes prejudice, which means that other forms of prejudice are being ignored?
Yeah, I am actually quite optimistic, because I received generally very positive feedback for my piece, from not from people from all ideological persuasions, actually. So I think one of the issues is that many people sort of espouse this definition of racism in a superficial sense, because it's a sort of more fashionable, rather than espousing it in a more deeper, well thought out sense. So I think if we can try to um, basically show them where this definition of racism leads to, then they would realize that it's not only ill-guided and unsophisticated, but it's also sinister.
Well, I think that's probably the case in those who aren't already doing it for sinister motives.
Yeah, but for people who are doing it for sinister motives, um, I'm 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 not sure. Like the how many people this describes. I would imagine it's a small minority, but I'm not entirely sure. Um, so it's a case of how can we persuade them out of it. With Wiley, I'm not too optimistic, to be honest. I think it's a more entrenched worldview, and I also think it suits his personality type. It suits his sort of bullish, sort of domineering character, which means that it's unlikely to ever change his mind on this subject. But I think with other people, perhaps we can persuade them out of it.
Amazing. Well, I think you articulated the key issues at play so brilliantly in your article, and we'll put a link to your article in the video description. But Tom, it was a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'd love to have you on again in the future on JTV.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.